Ladies and gentlemen, there are certain stories in life that don't make it to the headlines. They don't trend, they don't go viral, and they don't become hashtags. These are the stories that are lived quietly, intensely, almost invisibly, in the space between two heartbeats. And sometimes, those are the stories that shape everything else. What I'm going to talk about tonight is not a public spectacle. It's not a tabloid. It's not a news headline. It's something far more fragile, far more human, and far more defining than most people will ever realize. It's the hidden love story that was never spoken about, not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered too much. Love, in its truest form, doesn't always exist in grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It often lives in the moments no one sees, in the quiet resilience of two people building something together, in the subtle gravity that pulls them toward each other, even when the world is falling apart. For someone like me, living a life orbiting around technology, innovation, and impossible goals, love has always been a paradox. It's both an anchor and a propulsion system. It can keep you grounded, but it can also give you the force to reach beyond the stars. When I look back, I don't see love as a single event. I see it as a timeline, a series of decisions, sacrifices, long silences, and quiet revolutions of the heart. I remember the first time it happened, not like a lightning bolt, but more like gravity. Subtle, invisible, but undeniable. It wasn't about appearance, status, or anything the world would recognize as extraordinary. It was about the way two human minds collided, not in chaos, but in perfect resonance. As a scientist, I've spent years trying to understand the mechanisms behind human behavior, how emotions shape our neural pathways, how attachment wires itself into our biology, how the brain quite literally learns to need another person. When two people experience profound emotional connection, something extraordinary happens at the neurological level. Their limbic systems begin to synchronize, heart rates align, cortisol levels drop, oxytocin, the molecule of trust, rises. And this isn't poetic exaggeration, it's measurable. If you were to put two deeply connected people into separate MRI scanners, you would see patterns begin to mirror, not perfectly, but rhythmically, like a shared song. That was what made it so powerful. Love wasn't an interruption in the journey, it became the hidden current beneath it. And yet, the world never saw it. They saw the rockets, the cars, the satellites, the conferences. But they didn't see the quiet late nights, the conversations that stretched beyond logic into something more raw, more human. They didn't see the warmth that anchored the chaos, or the way a single voice could silence an entire storm in my mind. I've always believed that ambition, in its purest form, is an act of love. People think it's about ego, about legacy, about power. It's not. At its core, ambition is about trying to build a future worth loving. And love, real love, fuels that. Not because it makes the journey easier, but because it gives it meaning. There was a moment, years ago, when everything around me felt like it was crumbling. Financial uncertainty, relentless public scrutiny, sleepless nights that blurred into each other. It was a time when logic failed to provide clarity, and in that darkness, there was one constant presence, a quiet voice on the other end of a call at 3 a.m., a pair of hands holding mine in silence when no words would have made sense. The world might see strength as standing alone, but I've learned that real strength is often born in connection. And connection, when it's real, is not transactional. It doesn't keep score. It doesn't demand the spotlight. It exists quietly, like the hum of a machine you've stopped noticing, but without which everything collapses. I want to talk to you not just as a technologist or entrepreneur, but as a human being who has spent years trying to understand why love shapes us so deeply. From a neurobiological perspective, love is not an illusion. It's not a distraction. It's a deeply embedded survival mechanism. When we fall in love, the brain's reward centers, particularly the ventral tegmental area, light up with dopamine. This is the same area that lights up with innovation, discovery, and creation. That's not coincidence. The same circuits that make us dream about colonizing planets also make us dream about holding someone's hand in the dark. The same fire, the same wiring, and that's why, even in the most rational, data-driven, mission-focused moments of my life, love was the one variable I couldn't model, couldn't optimize, couldn't control. And maybe that's what made it real. We live in a world that tells us to focus on achievements, to quantify our worth in metrics, valuations, and milestones. But there's no unit to measure how someone's voice can steady your heartbeat. There's no algorithm to capture the moment you realize that someone understands your silence is better than your words. And in that absence of measurement, love exists as the purest form of truth. There were times when love felt like a hidden mission, one parallel to everything else I was building, a mission not written into business plans or launch schedules, a mission that was never meant to be a headline. And maybe that's why it lasted as long as it did, because it didn't need the world's validation to be real. But love isn't static. It's dynamic. It grows, it bends, it challenges. It sometimes demands things the world doesn't understand. In my case, it demanded sacrifice, and not the kind that makes for romantic movies. The quiet, brutal kind. The kind where two people realize that loving each other doesn't always mean being able to stay together. I've often said that if something is important enough, even if the odds are against you, you should still do it. Love is no exception. But it's also true that love can exist without possession. It can thrive in memory, in respect, in the unseen spaces where two lives once aligned. That's the part no one talks about. The strength it takes to love without needing to hold, to care without needing to claim. The neuroscientific reality is this: love rewires the brain. It leaves traces long after the story has shifted. Synaptic connections formed through shared experiences don't just vanish. They soften, they fade, but they remain. You carry the other person in the architecture of your neural networks. And that's not weakness. That's proof of having lived deeply. I remember moments, not events. A half smile in the middle of an argument that dissolved the tension. A silence that felt louder than any speech. A hand squeezing mine right before a launch. Not because it changed the outcome, but because it reminded me I wasn't alone. Those are not things the world sees. They're not milestones. They're coordinates. Fixed points in the map of who I've become. And it's strange, isn't it? How the most transformative chapters of a life can remain unwritten. How love can shape entire worlds without a single public acknowledgement. Some people call that secrecy. I call it sacred. People assume that to love someone in an extraordinary life, the love itself must be extraordinary. But it's often the opposite. The love that matters most is the quietest, simplest kind. The one that doesn't demand the world to look because it knows its worth. Science tells us that the brain is constantly predicting, modeling the future based on what it's experienced before. Love is the only force that disrupts that prediction engine. It introduces chaos, beautiful, necessary chaos, that forces us to grow beyond our own blueprints. That's why falling in love feels both terrifying and exhilarating. It's the brain stepping into uncharted territory. When I look at the trajectory of my life, love was never the detour. It was the undercurrent shaping the direction. And perhaps the most profound truth I've learned is that love doesn't need a spotlight to be real. It doesn't need validation to be infinite. Sometimes its power lies precisely in its invisibility. There was a night, one of those rare, still nights between endless storms, when we sat in silence, watching the stars. She looked at me, not with awe or expectation, but with understanding, and in that moment, everything made sense. The ambition, the failures, the weight, the mission. None of it existed outside of that gaze. It was as if the entire universe collapsed into two people sharing the same breath. And that is a kind of gravity no rocket can escape. Love is not a weakness in a world that idolizes strength. It's the root of all resilience. It's the quiet fuel that makes you walk back into the fire again and again, not because you enjoy the pain, but because somewhere, at some point, someone made you believe in something larger than yourself. When the world looked at me, they saw a builder of machines. But what they didn't see was the heartbeat beneath the steel. The soft echo of someone else's laughter embedded in the rhythm of impossible dreams. They saw the launch pads, but not the hands that steadied me before stepping on them. They saw the victories, not the whispered words in the shadows that made those victories bearable. If love had a language, it would be silence. If it had a form, it would be gravity. It doesn't demand attention. It simply shapes everything it touches. And maybe that's why the story was never spoken about, because the moment you try to define something infinite, you risk diminishing it. Because love, in its purest form, doesn't belong to the world, it belongs to the two who lived it. That hidden love story wasn't about power or publicity. It wasn't about the world knowing. It was about two minds finding resonance in the middle of noise. And even now, when the world sees only the machinery of ambition, I know that somewhere in the background, like a star that's no longer visible, but still burning in the sky, that love still hums quietly in the architecture of my memory. And that is enough. But let me take you deeper into why this kind of love matters. Not just for me, but for every human being who dares to dream beyond themselves. The human brain evolved not in isolation, but in connection. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of complex reasoning, planning, and imagination, didn't just develop to build machines or write code. It developed to communicate, to understand, to love. We are, at the most fundamental level, creatures wired for connection. That's not sentimentality. That's evolutionary fact. When you look at the arc of human innovation, from fire to flight to interplanetary dreams, you'll see a constant thread: love. Love for survival, for family, for a future that outlives us. Every great leap forward begins with someone caring deeply enough about something or someone. And so, when people ask why this love story was never told, the answer is simple. It didn't need to be told. It was never about legacy. It was about living. It was about the quiet resilience that makes ambition human, the heartbeat behind the machine. There's a misconception that those who chase impossible dreams must do so alone. But the truth is, no one truly does. Even the greatest journeys are built on invisible bridges of love, trust, and shared humanity. This love didn't demand to be known. It demanded to be real. And here's the thing about real love. It doesn't need an audience to validate its existence. It doesn't need applause, headlines, or narratives. It thrives in spaces that the world often overlooks, in the moments between chaos and clarity, in the quiet trust between two people who understand each other's storms. I've often wondered why we, as a society, put so much emphasis on the love that's visible. We celebrate the extravagant proposals, the grand weddings, the perfect Instagram captions. But the love that shapes us the most is rarely photogenic. It happens in quiet kitchens at 2 a.m., in long drives where no one says a word, in the steady rhythm of someone's breathing next to you, when the world outside is on fire. That's the kind of love that rewrites the story of a life without needing to sign its name anywhere. For someone living at the intersection of science and vision, love has always been an anomaly I couldn't quantify. I could build rockets, predict trajectories, and calculate probabilities with frightening accuracy. But love, it doesn't obey Newton. It doesn't respect equations. It laughs at linearity. It bends logic, time, and often your sense of self. There were moments when I stood at launch pads, surrounded by hundreds of people, with every camera and eye fixed on me. And yet, in that moment, the only presence that felt real wasn't in front of me, but behind the noise, a presence that steadied me. That's the irony of love. It can be invisible to the world, but louder than any roar in your own heart. And this hidden love story, it was exactly that. A quiet axis on which the chaos of my universe revolved. A story that didn't need to be told because it was written in neural pathways, in late night texts, in shared silences, and in a trust so unshakable that words often felt unnecessary. People often assume love in extraordinary lives must also be extraordinary. But in truth, the love that held me together was profoundly ordinary. It was the kind of love that didn't care about who was watching. It cared about whether I had eaten that day, whether I was sleeping enough, whether I remembered, in the midst of trying to change the world, to stay human. As a neuroscientist, I can tell you that the most important thing love gives us is safety. Not the kind that shields us from pain, but the kind that allows the nervous system to stop bracing for it. When two people trust each other deeply, their amygdalas, the brain's fear centers, soften their constant vigilance. Oxytocin floods the bloodstream, lowering blood pressure, calming heart rate, allowing the prefrontal cortex to take over. That's when the brain can imagine, build, create. Love, quite literally, is what allows us to dream without fear. That's why it mattered. Not because it was romantic in the cinematic sense, but because it was stabilizing, because it turned chaos into direction. There were long stretches of my life when failure felt inevitable, when sleep was an indulgence, when every decision was a gamble with impossible stakes. And during those times, love was the quiet presence that didn't try to solve the equations with me. It simply made sure I didn't drown in them. She didn't need to understand every detail of a launch window or the fragility of a funding round. She just needed to remind me, without words, that I was more than the outcomes of my battles. That kind of love doesn't get remembered in history books. It doesn't get quoted in interviews. But it's the only kind of love that has the power to sustain a human being standing in a storm that never ends. Science has an elegant way of proving what poets have known for centuries. We're not built to face the universe alone. Our nervous systems are social structures. Our survival depends on attunement, the subtle, almost invisible exchange of signals between people who trust each other. A glance, a touch, a silence. That's what keeps us alive when ambition tries to burn us out. I remember the day I almost gave up. Not because I didn't believe in the mission anymore, but because my body simply couldn't take it. My hands shook. My chest was tight. My thoughts were like noise in a collapsing tunnel. And then, without drama, without any grand gesture, she just held my hand. No speeches, no solutions, just presence. And in that moment, my brain recalibrated. The panic softened. My heartbeat steadied. And I realized, love isn't always the reason we reach for the stars. Sometimes, it's the reason we can keep standing on the ground. The world glorifies individual strength. But no rocket lifts off without a launch pad. No starship travels without its anchor. Love was my launch pad. Quiet, unseen, but unshakable. And yet, love is not a linear story. It doesn't promise happy endings. It's made of chapters, some luminous, some shattering. We reached a point where love had to transform, not disappear, because sometimes the most profound love isn't the one that stays. It's the one that sets you free. There's a misconception that endings diminish love. But neuroscientifically speaking, that's not true. When love ends in form, it doesn't end in imprint. The neural pathways built through deep connection don't simply erase themselves. They become part of your cognitive architecture, shaping the way you think, feel, and see the world. In that sense, love doesn't leave. It integrates. I still remember the last conversation. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. There was no anger, no accusation. Just two people acknowledging that sometimes, even the most powerful gravitational forces have to drift into different orbits. And in that quiet acceptance, I learned something no equation could teach me: love doesn't need permanence to be eternal. Even now, years later, there are moments, subtle, fleeting moments, when I'll hear a song, see a flicker of light at dusk, or feel the silence before a storm, and my brain will bring her back, not as a wound, not as a regret, but as a part of the architecture that built me. The hippocampus, the brain's memory center, doesn't store love as isolated data points. It stores it as sensory imprints, woven into your identity. You don't just remember love, you become it. And perhaps that's why I never spoke about this story. Because it wasn't just something that happened to me. It's something I am. It's in the way I breathe before walking on a stage. It's in the way I look at a starry sky. It's in the silent strength beneath the surface of every impossible dream. People have asked me countless times what drives me. What makes someone push against the gravitational pull of what's easy, to pursue something that seems impossible? They expect answers like curiosity, or legacy, or ambition. But the truth is, it was love, a quiet, unspoken love, not just for a person, for what she made me believe in, for the world we almost built together, for the version of myself she helped me discover. This story never made it into interviews or memoirs, not because it didn't matter, but because it was never meant to be consumed. It was meant to be lived, quietly. And maybe that's the greatest kind of love, the kind that doesn't need to be remembered by the world, because it has already changed yours forever. You see, love isn't about who stays in your life. It's about who stays in your wiring. It's about who altered the way your neurons fire when you dream, who shaped the silence you return to when the noise gets too loud. I stand here today, surrounded by inventions, missions, visions of futures that don't yet exist. But beneath all of it, there's a quiet heartbeat that isn't made of metal or code. It's made of someone's laugh in a kitchen, someone's voice in the dark, someone's hand at the edge of the impossible. I never spoke about that love because some stories are not meant to be owned. They're meant to be honored. And honoring it means letting it live in the spaces between words, in the pauses, in the gravity that never leaves you. This story isn't about me. It's about how love, even when hidden, can shape empires, launch rockets, build futures. It's about how something soft can coexist with something unstoppable. How the most fragile things can be the most powerful forces in the universe. If there's one truth I've learned, it's this: love does not need to be seen to be infinite. It does not need to be named to be real. It does not need to be held to be felt. It just is. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why the hidden love story was never spoken about. Not because it was forgotten, but because it was eternal. Because even now, beneath the weight of every mission, in the silence between the stars, it still lives, not as a story told, but as a pulse that never stopped beating. Thank you.